What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be comparing Samsung's two newest higher-end A-series devices, the A53 5G and the A73 5G. Now, in years past, when we had an A50-something and an A70-something, there were some significant differences that separated them. But this year, these two phones are closer than ever, and honestly, there's only a handful of relatively minor things that differentiates them now from one another. If you're in the market for a new phone, hopefully this comparison clears things up a bit and helps you decide which one is best for you. But if you just want the quick summary, jumping to the A73 will get you a slightly bigger screen, slightly better processor, and marginally better camera. That's the foundation of it. But let's break it all down a bit further, and I'll fill you in on everything else you need to know about these two phones. So first off, let me just quickly break down the pricing and availability. The A53 5G is going to be the cheaper of the two. Its full retail price is technically $449. But right now, there are tons of discounts and deals to be had, both from Samsung directly and from third-party retailers like Amazon. In fact, it's $100 off at least right now, under $350 as I'm filming this video. So don't miss out on that price cut if you really want that phone. The A73 5G, on the other hand, is listed right now for about $530, give or take, depending on where you live. I haven't yet seen any deals or discounts on this phone, unfortunately. It's kind of been a slow, staggered release, but generally speaking, you are going to be paying at least $100 more for it. So that's the first consideration. And if you're interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own or checking in on those deals, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to where you can get these phones at their cheapest current prices. Physically, if I didn't tell you these two phones were slightly different, you probably wouldn't have noticed, but they are. The A53 is a slightly smaller 6.5-inch device. The A73 comes in at 6.7 inches. Those are the screen sizes, corner to corner, and you can see that the overall phone size and build differ just by a few millimeters, if that, on each. Mostly in height, a little bit in width, but honestly, the difference here is so minuscule that it really doesn't impact anything. I don't think most people will notice or even care about the 0.2 of an inch difference in screen size. It doesn't really yield you anything in the end. And in the hand, while I guess the A73 is slightly taller, they're both big-sized Samsung phones in the same basic shape and form factor that we've had for a few years now. Up top, both phones have center hole punch selfie cameras. The A73's selfie camera is bigger for whatever reason, not too important, but I know some people like to point that out. Down at the bottom, the A73 also has a slightly smaller bottom chin and tiny bit slimmer bezels all around for a screen to body ratio that's all of 2% better than the A53. But overall, from the front, these phones are nearly identical. And around back, they are absolutely identical. You get the same design, same build, and same materials too. All plastic rear cover with a smooth matte finish, the same size and style camera bump, different color selections if that matters to you at all. This mint green is only for the A73. The A53 has blue and peach color options, but that's not too important. They both have the same polished metal-like frame, the same flat profile with a sort of ice cream sandwich-like form factor, if you want to call it that. No real curves or contours. Both phones are also IP67 water and dust resistant for some added protection, which is great. But again, overall, aside from the slight difference in size, these phones look and feel basically the same. In taking a quick look around at everything else, nothing at all on the left side of either phone there. On the right, similar volume and power buttons, though just placed differently. The A73's buttons are higher up on the phone. The A53's buttons are more towards the middle, which actually makes them a little easier to feel for if that matters to you. Up top, this is where the A73 has its dual SIM and SD card tray, while the A53 has its dual SIM and SD card tray at the bottom. Both phones also have the same USB-C port for charging, the same downward speaker setup, and the same lack of a headphone jack as well. Both phones have a secondary speaker in the earpiece above the selfie camera there, and around back, quad lens camera setups on both with slightly different hardware specs that I'll talk more about in just a bit. Underneath the displays, both phones offer in-display fingerprint readers, and as far as I know, this is the same setup and hardware. For as many times as I've tested them, they wake and unlock at nearly the same speed. The A73 is maybe a tiny bit quicker, more so with a double tap to wake, but either way, I don't see much else of a difference or advantage with either device. So speaking of the displays, like I explained at the start, this used to be an area where these phones would differ, but this year, Samsung gave both the A53 and A73 essentially the exact same specs and features. The 6.5-inch screen on the A53 is a Super AMOLED panel, the 2400 by 1080 resolution at 405 pixels per inch, 800 nits of max brightness, and a 120 Hz refresh rate. The 6.7-inch screen on the A73 is a Super AMOLED Plus panel panel, though I've yet to see a noticeable difference with that distinction, also coming in at a resolution of 2400 by 1080 for 393 pixels per inch, 800 nits of max brightness, and also a 120 Hz high refresh rate. Side by side, I really can't tell a difference at all when it comes to brightness, color, contrast, resolution, or anything else. The viewing experiences here are more or less identical. I suppose if you really want to get nitpicky, the white balance kind of differs a bit. The A53 has a slightly yellowish tone, the A73 is more bluish, I suppose, but I don't really think that matters too much, and you can make slight adjustments to both phones' display profile and settings. The important stuff, like I said, is all the same, and you're just not really going to get any more for your money this time around and going with a more expensive A73 this year. Actually, I'd argue that if the viewing experience is what's most important to you, this is a great reason to just opt for the A53. You get the same specs anyway, at a much cheaper price. In the end, both these displays are great, flagship caliber. In fact, there's just nothing really this year that differentiates them. This is the same story with the out loud listening experience. Both these phones have great dual stereo speaker setups with one at the bottom there and the secondary speaker in the earpiece. This is a great add-on for these two A-series phones. It's something I personally do value quite a bit, and to me, they sound exactly the same. But here's a sample of each so you can decide for yourself. Okay, so up to this point, honestly, these two phones have been basically identical with what they offer. Now let's talk about the two things that actually set them apart this year: the internal specs and the cameras. Starting with the internals, the A53 5G is powered by Samsung's own Exynos 1280 chipset. You can spec it with either 4, 6, or 8 gigs of RAM and 128 or 256 gigs of internal storage. The A73 5G gets Qualcomm's new Snapdragon 778G 5G chipset paired with 6 or 8 gigs of RAM and similar 128 or 256 gig storage options. Now, you could technically spec both phones with the same RAM and same storage options, and at that point, the only difference you'd have is the processor. And if you're curious about the Geekbench scores, well, here you go. You can see, of course, that the A73 is going to have quite a bit of an advantage across the board. And by the way, to also hopefully show you some difference, my A53 has 6 gigs of RAM, while my A73 has 8 gigs of RAM. So keep that in mind when we do this side-by-side speed test. Because these are two of the newest high-end A-series phones for 2022, you can expect them to also have the latest Android and One UI updates, so that evens the playing field there. And when we're talking about speed and performance, really, if you're just mainly going to be using your phone for the basic stuff, default Android apps and Samsung apps, phone calls, text messages, web browsing, YouTube watching, I really don't think you're going to experience a noticeable difference. Certainly not for some $100 more at least. For the most part, apps launch and load similarly. The A73 tends to get there first almost every time, of course, but is having this phone going to yield you a significant, noticeable, consistent advantage? Not really. You'll start to notice the difference more if you like playing games, especially the more complex, graphics-heavy stuff. If that's what you're into, I think you will experience noticeably faster launch and load times with the A73, and slightly better in-game performance as well. The more intense the game, the more significant the difference. You can shave off quite a few seconds of waiting, which I think you can see, and like I said, while I don't think the A53 has any performance issues, the A73 just tends to be smoother and more consistent, which makes sense given its potential for more power. Out of everything, this is basically what you're going to be paying for and going with the more expensive A73, and this is where you kind of need to decide if it's worth that extra money. Based on your individual day-to-day usage, do you feel as though the extra processor is worth it? If you play a ton of games and absolutely want the best possible in-app experience, the faster load times, the ability to bump up those graphics without having to think about it, then yeah, it probably makes sense to grab the A73. But I think for 80 to 90% of smartphone users, the A53 is going to be not just fine, but really good. And when you factor in the price, not just the fact that it's $100 or more cheaper, but some 20% cheaper when we look at the overall values, I don't think you're getting 20% more phone or something 20% better in going with the A73, unless you're really pushing the device. That's just my opinion on this whole thing, but let me know what you guys think about the performance aspect. This is pretty much the biggest factor that separates these two phones this year. When it comes to the batteries, both devices get a pretty large 5,000 milliamp capacity, which is great, certainly bigger than average, with 25-watt fast charging speed support as well. No wireless charging or any other power features, unfortunately, but I think this is a fine setup for these two phones. In my time using them, I didn't personally notice a difference or an advantage one way or another. They're both all-day phones and then some, but I don't think you're going to get significantly more out of one or another, no matter how you use each device. And finally, when it comes to the camera setups, this is really the only other thing that is objectively different between the two phones, but the difference here is also very minor. So the main lens on the A53 is a 64 megapixel f1.8 aperture shooter. The main lens on the A73 is a 108 megapixel f1.8 aperture shooter, but the other three lenses on each phone, the 12 megapixel ultra wide, 5 megapixel macro, and 5 megapixel depth sensor, appear to be exactly the same. And the selfie cameras up front, while they differ in physical size, like I mentioned, for whatever reason, they don't seem to differ in specs. They're both 32 megapixel lenses. And inside the camera app, 99% of the shooting modes and features are the same across the board. These are both very well optioned camera setups with tons of great stuff to utilize. We no longer get any extra zoom capabilities like we did on last year's A72, but we have pro picture and video controls, night mode, super slow-mo, hyperlapse. The two differences I did spot are, of course, the high megapixel shooting modes and the advanced video stabilization. You can enable that when shooting in 4K on the A73, but not in 4K on the A53. Aside from that, I don't see any other differences in capabilities and settings and features. Again, maybe I'm missing something, feel free to let me know, but that's great if you opt for the A53. You're not going to miss out on much. And again, that doesn't really bode well for the A73 in offering you more for the higher price tag. In snapping a couple sample pictures here, I think you can definitely see that the final product does differ. With the selfie camera, the color in each shot is pretty different, but that's something that can be adjusted after the fact. The A73 tends to be brighter, the A53 gives off a bluish tone. Detail-wise, they're close, but I actually do think the A73 is the winner there. All in all though, both great looking selfie pictures with minor differences that I don't really think impact anything significantly. With the rear camera shots, it's a similar story. The exposure differs quite a bit. The A53 is very bright. Similar color though, this time with the A73 on the right. It's just a little more cool blue. I think it's also going to give you more detail again, but all in all, I'm just not really sure there's enough here to really sway you one way or another, even if pictures and videos are very important to you. I realize though that these are just a couple quick sample shots. I'll have a more in-depth camera comparison in a separate video, but to me, I'm really not sure the A73 is going to yield you a huge noticeable difference. So the story with the A53 and A73 this year seems to be that the A73 is once again a tiny bit bigger by just a fraction of an inch. It offers a better processor at least, which yields faster speeds for mostly gaming, I'd say, but both phones can be spec'd the same with RAM and storage options, and the A73 technically has a better camera, but not significantly better, and only with the main lens. And that's kind of it. The A73 is just not significantly better this year. Certainly not $100 plus better, which to me makes the A53 the much better deal in the end. But what do you guys think? Is there any real reason to grab the A73 5G? Maybe I missed something. Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.